our reading this morning is a poem called How to Discuss the Truth by Unitarian Universalist minister Mark Bellatini. How to discuss the truth that some men love men, and some women, women, and some both, with the children in the church school and church home. Nonchalantly, without drum rolls, without tiptoe preparations, without calculating and predicting to the nth degree. With candor, with open ears, with unfailing tenderness, with one foot in the realm of God and the other foot on that solid earth made of the ashes of Radcliffe Hall, Auden, Da Vinci, Emma Goldman, Susan B. Anthony, and Mark DeWolf. With real hope in our purpose and thanksgiving in our pulse. With the full iris of our living tradition in the eye. Without using the inherited Augustinian scalpel that splits flesh from spirit and pleasure from good. Without homilies on toleration. With the words some of us and not the words them and they. With as much heart as intellect, without embarrassment. With stories and examples as wonderful as a tale by SCUUF. With rhapsodies on the glories of friendship, with gladness for uncertainties, with joy. So, with stories and examples as wonderful as a tale by SCUUF. That line just jumped out at me as I was reading that poem. And yes, we Unitarian Universalists have those kinds of stories to tell in Pride Month, stories for us to celebrate. Unitarian Universalists individually and collectively have often been at the forefront of LGBTQIA+ justice efforts. We were among the first to conduct same-sex union services long before they were legally recognized. We were among the first to ordain openly gay clergy, and I do specifically in this moment mean gay men in particular, and later openly lesbian, bisexual, and transgender clergy. We responded with love rather than hate to the AIDS crisis. We were leaders in the fight for marriage equality in a variety of states and at the national level. The first of our 7 Unitarian Universalist principles outlined in the bylaws of our Unitarian Universalist Association affirms the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And we have demonstrated for decades that every person certainly includes LGBTQIA+ folks. It is equally true, however, that we have not been perfect in this area. My wife and I are both Unitarian Universalist women ministers, a queer clergy couple, something that just a generation ago might have been unthinkable even in our liberal denomination. When I came out in 2014, I didn't worry at all about losing either the faith to which I had belonged since childhood or my position as ministerial intern at a Unitarian Universalist congregation. That was not true for my colleagues in ministry just a few decades ago, during the same years that my family was discovering Unitarian Universalism in Omaha, Nebraska. I don't remember any openly LGBTQIA+ people in my childhood church. And I now realize that the reason for that may not be so much that I was oblivious as that it wasn't safe in the 1970s and 1980s in Nebraska, even in a liberal religious setting like ours. It was sobering for me to realize that it has been within my lifetime that our liberal denomination had very real, and I'm here to tell you, not always compassionate debates about the humanity and the rights of people like me. I also recognize that as a cisgender white woman, my queer identity is still more readily accepted than some others. There are, unfortunately, barriers to full inclusion even today, particularly for transgender individuals, including clergy and other religious professionals who have found it hard to find and keep ministry positions and other jobs in churches. Just an aside here is that anyone with a marginalized identity, whether it's a queer person, a trans person, a person of color, a person with a disability, their ministerial tenures at churches are usually shorter than straight white men. That is still true today. The barriers are more and more complex for people who hold more than one marginalized identity, such as sexual orientation and race, or gender identity and neurodivergence. We have made progress, but there is still work to do. I'm working on a book for the UUA's Skinner House Books, which tells the story of the intersection of LGBTQIA+ lives and Unitarian Universalist faith. Stories that tell that intersectional piece at personal, congregational, and denominational levels. The book also illustrates times when our faith has contributed to societal transformation with regard to the lives of LGBTQIA+ people, most notably in the AIDS crisis and with regard to marriage equality. The book will include stories from people who lived through some of the key historical episodes in our denominational history with regards to LGBTQIA people. It is important for me to note that sometimes two of the authors may have different recollections of some of the same events. This is, of course, true with history of any kind because of the way that human memory works. When the book is published, I hope that readers will set aside any inclination to decide whose version is right or wrong, and instead focus on the larger messages in each of the powerful essays. The stories that have been submitted to me so far have often moved me to tears, either tears of sorrow for the harm done to individuals, or tears of pride in Unitarian Universalists for taking faithful risks to further the cause of LGBTQIA+ justice and inclusion. Unfortunately, I don't have permission yet to share the specifics of the contributors' stories or to read from them because the book is still in progress. What I can share, though, in addition to some of the overarching themes and some of the historical details that are present in those stories, is how I'm approaching the telling of the stories and some of what I have learned along the way. The book is part of a larger project called the UU Rainbow History Project, which was sponsored by the UU Retired Ministers and Partners Association, which is abbreviated RMAPA, and it was partially funded by a grant from the UU funding program. Their project began as a recognition of the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, and it includes a website, uurainbowhistory.net, 2 conferences in 2019, which was the 50th anniversary year, an archive, which is probably going to be housed at Harvard Divinity School's library, and now this book project, which may actually be 2 books, although that hasn't been decided for sure yet. There's just so much that we're not sure we can fit it into 1 volume. There are many powerful stories, keynote speeches, and panel discussions on that website, some of which may make it into the book in one form or another. The larger project originally focused on the history and stories of not only LGBTQIA folks, but specifically ministers, their partners, and also their allies. In the book, together with Skinner House, I have made the decision to center only the voices of LGBTQIA+ folks rather than allies. Those allies' stories are valuable, but this book is not the place for them. And I have also expanded the scope beyond ministers and their partners to include religious educators, other religious professionals, and congregants, many of whom hold important stories. We are actually still writing this history as we continue to resist efforts to limit LGBTQIA+ rights in our current era. My hope is that the book will inspire us by showing both our successes and our failures as we have imperfectly lived into our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person and the inclusion specifically of LGBTQIA+ people in that affirmation. While I have been gathering as many stories as possible from as many sources as possible, I know that this will inherently be an incomplete collection. A broad sampling of the stories that are out there, some of which are known and some are relatively unknown. Not everyone who could share a story wants to, and I'll touch on that again later. Not all the stories still have people who are alive to tell them. I've done my best, and yet I know there will be missing pieces. Given that, my job has been to make the book as representative as possible of the stories that I know are out there, stories both of the past and of the present. We are losing some of our LGBTQ plus pioneers even as we work on the book. One example is Reverend Dr. Dorothy Emerson, who was key to this project in its early stages, and I was brought on board after her death. During the writing of the book, which is actually still ongoing, we have lost Jay Deacon, another pioneer, and Alandria Williams, who was recently co-moderator of the UUA and a non-binary person. Those losses made it all the more clear that it is urgent for us to capture this history before we lose access to it. However, I'm also aware that no single book, even if it becomes 2 books, can contain all of the relevant stories. And I'm very clear that no one owes me or us their stories, not the us behind the book project, nor the us of the book's eventual audience. With that clarity, I have intentionally honored both explicit answers of, no, thank you, I don't want to be included, and silence in response to requests for stories. It's possible that in doing that, I have inadvertently omitted someone who would have wished to say yes, and for that, I will offer my apology. But it's very important to me that we recognize that people have valid reasons sometimes for not wanting to tell these very personal, vulnerable stories. When I first began working on the book project 2.5 years ago, one of my primary goals was to tell as complete a history up to the present moment in our denomination as possible. The successes, the failures, and the complexities. The stories in the book both celebrate the ways in which Unitarian Universalists as individuals, congregations, and together as a denomination have chosen the side of love with regard to LGBTQIA+ people and our rights, and also to name where we have fallen painfully short, causing real harm to real human beings, some of whom are people I know and cherish. Here we are in 2022, and I have to name that there are still things to celebrate and things to regret. Beyond categorical thinking workshops, which are workshops held in congregations preparing to search for a new minister, still reveal biases around gender identity and sexual orientation, as well as race and other marginalized identities. At the Armapa conference in October 2019, Reverend Jane Dwinell, who had been doing these beyond categorical thinking workshops with congregations in search for a new minister for 22 years in 2019, she shared that what people worry about has changed. Quote, people are now freaked out about trans and queer ministers. I can tell you from personal experience that the church that I was called to in 2016, in their beyond categorical thinking workshop, it was revealed that some of them did not think they would be ready for a bisexual minister at that point in their history. So sometimes we think we've come further than we have. I want to go back to some of the people whose stories are not in the book. More than one person declined to share their story for the project because it felt unsafe to go public with what had happened to them in a congregation or in our denomination as a whole. Part of that is that we are a small denomination, and so when you tell a story, it's all too easy for people to figure out who some of the other characters in the story are, and that can feel very unsafe. There was an earlier iteration of this project attempted more than a decade ago. It might be 15 years now, and the author of that original project, Celeste DeRoche, did recorded interviews with people, and what she found was that at that time, it was primarily cisgender white gay men who were comfortable being interviewed. There were a few bisexual people and almost no transgender people. That has shifted in the years since she first began trying to create this project, but it is still true that it is safer for some people to be fully out than others, especially those who have stories to tell about the times that we failed them rather than stories of successes. If I were to go with only the material that is widely available already, including on the Rainbow History website that I mentioned, which is a rich resource, and I encourage you all to check it out, but it's very disproportionate in that it was first safe for white gay men to tell their stories, and then it became safe for white lesbian women to tell their stories. And slowly it began to be safe for some bisexual people, some queer people of color, and some transgender or non-binary people to tell their stories. And there are those for whom it still feels unsafe. So part of the work of the book has been to seek out some of those underrepresented stories and find people willing to talk about those areas with us. And that is still a challenge, but I'm committed to having this book not look like all the queer people in Unitarian Universalism are cisgender white gay men, which would be an easy thing to fall into. I also want to name that while the book project is focusing primarily on Unitarian Universalism within the United States and to a much lesser degree Canada, one of our tasks, both within the book and I believe in our faith as a whole, must be to recognize that LGBTQIA plus Unitarians, most of the world, they're just Unitarian, not Unitarian Universalist. In other parts of the world, they may experience much more discrimination and even overt persecution. For example, in Transylvania, where we have many partner churches, Unitarian churches face state pressure to not support gay marriage, which is still deeply controversial in Transylvania. And in Uganda, the situation is even worse, with threats and sometimes actual physical violence, sometimes even murder. We must continue to support LGBTQIA plus congregants, ministers, and religious professionals of all kinds, whether in brick and mortar congregations in the US and elsewhere, or those who participate primarily remotely online, such as incarcerated Unitarian Universalists who are members of the Church of the Larger Fellowship. If you're not familiar with the CLF, that is our Church Without Walls that exists entirely online. Decades ago, it was a church by mail service, originally to serve military families. But now a large portion of their membership is people who are incarcerated and can't attend church services outside of the prison. When I wrote an essay on coming out for the June 2019 edition of Quest Monthly, which is the newsletter of the Church of the Larger Fellowship, I received traditional postal mail, because they don't have access to email, from incarcerated CLF members who have to remain closeted while they are incarcerated for their own safety. It is particularly dangerous to be transgender in our prison system. Speaking of safety, many of us in the LGBTQIA plus community have feared for both our civil rights and our safety in recent years, particularly, but not only, under the Trump administration. Just as a personal example, my wife and I had a commitment ceremony years ago and didn't think we were ever going to need to get legally married. We weren't planning on more kids. My son was already a teenager when we got together. And these days you can do most of the medical and house owning and all of that stuff through other legal documents. But we did decide to get legally married in October of 2020, shortly after the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. And there were two factors in that decision for us. The driving factor was that we feared the overturn of national marriage equality, and we knew that we could protect our rights better if we had legal marriage documentation than if we didn't. And I know we were not alone in that. The second factor was that in the process of working on this book, I heard and read so many stories of peers, probably mostly not my generation, but one generation earlier, but peers both in UU ministry and lay people who fought so very hard for the right to marry. And the more of those stories I heard, the more I felt like choosing not to was dishonoring that work and not living up to that tradition. And I decided that it was something worth doing. My wife and I together decided it was worth doing. I have to say, though, that even with Trump out of office, there are continued threats to our rights and to our safety, both from the Supreme Court, which obviously includes 3 conservative justices appointed by Trump. For example, with the recent leak of the likely impending reversal of Roe versus Wade, most experts expect that to be just the first of many attempts at a widespread rollback of civil rights, including marriage equality. So very soon, I expect that my right to be married may disappear. And then on the safety side, you've probably all seen the news about the Patriot Front white supremacist group that showed up in Idaho at a Pride event, and 31 of them were arrested for showing up in riot gear, not to prevent a riot, but intending to start one. So it is a time when we do not necessarily feel safe. And I'm very aware that as the Minneapolis Pride celebration approaches next weekend, I'm going to be a little more hesitant than I have been in the past to be visible and public. I'll still do it, but we are not as safe as we were a few years ago, is the reality. Overall, in this project, one of the things I hope is that people will recognize that the personal stories of a wide variety of Unitarian Universalists, including my story, which is not remarkable compared to many of the ones in the book. There are amazing stories, and I can't wait to be able to share them once the book is officially complete. Each of those stories is unique, and yet they are also representative of the many other stories that will not make it into the book. I hope that these stories together will reinforce the understanding that LGBTQIA+ folks like myself, even within a single faith tradition, we are so far from being a monolith about whom broad generalizations can be made. Pretty much you can say two things about all of us. We're not straight, and we are Unitarian Universalist. Beyond that, we are widely varied. My hope as we together as a whole faith, continue to create and influence the stories of LGBTQIA+ people within Unitarian Universalism and beyond. My hope is that we will be mindful of both the best of our past. Just one example of that comes to me today is that our congregation in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which if you're not familiar with it, is on Cape Cod, and it is sort of a gay mecca and has been for decades. During the height of the AIDS crisis, that congregation rented multiple apartments and offered housing to young men who were dying of AIDS and cared for them in their last weeks and months. So we have stories like that to celebrate. I'm hoping that story will be in the book from a first person perspective. But if not, it'll at least be a sidebar because it's important to know. So I want us to be mindful of those kinds of stories, the ones about which we have every right to be so proud of our faith. But also the worst of it, the times that we pushed people out of their ministries, times that we didn't welcome people well in our congregations, and that we will then strive to create spaces in every one of our congregations where every person, every story is equally welcome. Now, I do need to say for the record, saying that everyone is equally welcome does not mean we welcome every behavior equally. It is just as important as welcoming in LGBTQIA+ or people of color or people with disabilities is that while we welcome everyone, if people engage in behavior that is oppressive, whether it's homophobic, anti-trans, racist, ableist, that we hold those people accountable to our values and invite them to either be in covenant with all of us, including those with marginalized identities, or to find a different faith home for themselves. I read once, probably on social media, I can't remember where exactly, that if you welcome both wolves and sheep, you will end up only with wolves because the sheep will know they are not safe in your space. So my hope is that we will not do that, that when we discover a wolf among us, we will invite them to either change their ways or to not be in our space causing harm to others. I know that's an imperfect analogy, primarily because most of the ways in which we fall short of true inclusion, and not just inclusion, but celebration of the LGBTQIA+ people among us, most of those ways are not malicious. They're not a wolf in sheep's clothing. They are rather thoughtless or uninformed. There's that saying about when you know better, do better. And that is, of course, part of human learning and growth. So please don't hear me saying that I expect us to be perfect. What I expect us to do is try and learn and do better. But we do get stuck on what we believe we know about grammar. I'm a former English major, so I can speak to that one. What we believe we know about grammar instead of honoring the pronouns that each person claims as their own. or we believe the myths and lies we have heard and deny the lived experiences of people who are right in front of us. It's the same thing that we do with people from other racial, ethnic, or cultural groups to which we don't belong. In this month of June, I want to remind us all that Pride is a celebration, and it's also a claiming of the right for each of us to be fully who we are, and specifically for those of us who are LGBTQIA+ to have equal standing legally and socially, and to be treated with equal respect and dignity under our first principle, as any of you who are straight. May we collectively rise to the occasion, not just in Pride Month when it's really fun to be an ally, but every day in ways big and small. May that be our practice and our prayer. Amen, and blessed be.